There are moments in history that don't announce themselves. They don't come with sirens or trumpets or the solemn gravity of official proclamations. They arrive quietly, in the hours before dawn, in the trembling hands of a telegraph operator who can barely read what he's transcribing, in the ash-gray face of a general who has just received a phone call and doesn't know how to begin the next one. June 22nd, 1941. 3:15 in the morning. You've never experienced a silence quite like the one that fell over Moscow that night. Not the silence of peace. Peace has a softness to it, an ease, not the silence of sleep, which has its own rhythm and depth. This was the silence of the world holding its breath before it breaks apart. I want you to stay close to me here, because what happened in the next few hours was not simply a military catastrophe. It was something far more fundamental, something that should matter to you whether you've ever held a weapon in your life or not. Because what happened in the early hours of June 22nd was the story of what it costs when a human being, regardless of how much power they hold, regardless of how intelligent they genuinely are, cannot bring themselves to believe the truth. This is the story of the greatest act of self-deception in the history of modern warfare. And it begins not on the battlefield, where historians so often look, but inside the mind of one man, a man who had spent his entire career making certain that no one around him could challenge his version of reality. A man who had built a system so perfectly designed around his own certainty that when his certainty was catastrophically wrong, that system had no mechanism left to correct itself. Joseph Stalin. The man who trusted no one, and on the one night that trust mattered more than anything else in the world, he trusted the only person he had never learned to doubt himself. Before you can understand what happened on June 22nd, you need to understand the world as Stalin saw it in the months leading up to that morning. Not as a caricature, not as a monster in a history book, as a man with a specific and internally coherent view of how the world worked, and why that view led him, step by logical step, to one of the most catastrophic decisions any leader has ever made. By the spring of 1941, warnings of an imminent German attack were arriving in Moscow with a frequency and specificity that should have been impossible to dismiss. British intelligence had been passing dispatches for months, not vague assessments. Specific operational details, unit movements, logistical preparations, the repositioning of German armored divisions to forward staging areas. Winston Churchill, who had no particular reason to do Stalin any favors, wrote him a personal letter in April of 1941. Churchill laid out, in plain language, what British intelligence had observed along the Soviet-German frontier. The German military posture, Churchill argued, could only be interpreted as preparation for invasion. Stalin read the letter putting down, and he told his inner circle that Churchill was attempting to drag the Soviet Union into a war with Germany by manufacturing the appearance of a threat, a provocation, a piece of theater designed by London to serve British interests. His own intelligence apparatus, the NKVD, the GRU, military intelligence at every level, was producing report after report that painted the same picture as Churchill's letter, but the reports coming from Soviet agents were even more alarming than the British assessments, because many of them contained the kind of granular operational detail that only comes from sources with direct access to German military planning. The legendary Richard Sorge, one of the most effective intelligence agents in history, was operating out of Tokyo. He had cultivated sources inside the German embassy there, sources with genuine access to operational plans. Sorge sent Moscow a series of increasingly urgent dispatches in the spring of 1941. He provided troop strength estimates, he named specific German units and their expected axes of advance. At one point, his intelligence was so precise that he named June 22nd as the expected date of attack. Stalin received those reports. He read them personally, and then he picked up his red pencil and wrote his response in the margin of one particular intelligence summary, a summary that detailed German preparations in language so specific, it should have ended the debate entirely. He wrote, "This information is an English provocation. Find out who is responsible for this disinformation and punish them." Let that land for a moment. A man has risked his life and the lives of his sources to send accurate, actionable intelligence across thousands of miles. The man receiving that intelligence, the man with the ultimate responsibility for the safety of 200 million people, responds by threatening to punish the messenger for telling the truth. How does a man of obvious intelligence, and whatever else Stalin was, he was demonstrably not stupid. He had outmaneuvered every rival who ever underestimated him, arrive at a conclusion so catastrophically, almost incomprehensibly wrong? That is the question I want to explore with you, because the answer isn't a story about a uniquely evil or uniquely foolish man. The answer lives in the ordinary architecture of the human mind. The answer is something you should recognize, because some version of it has probably affected every important decision you have ever made. To understand Stalin's reasoning in the spring of 1941, you have to go back to August of 1939. On August 23rd of that year, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Malatov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop signed what became known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, it was a non-aggression agreement between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Secretly, it also divided Eastern Europe into Soviet and German spheres of influence, a deal that enabled Hitler to invade Poland without fear of Soviet intervention, and that gave Stalin time and territory to strengthen his own position. Stalin understood from the moment he signed that agreement that it was a tactical arrangement, not a genuine peace. He didn't trust Hitler. He didn't trust anyone but Believ, and this is the belief that would prove fatal. He believed that he understood Hitler's strategic logic, and based on that understanding, he was certain that Hitler would not attack the Soviet Union until Britain had been defeated. The reasoning was straightforward, and not unreasonable on its face. Germany had already been broken once by the two-front war of 1914 to 1918. Hitler knew this history. Hitler had written about it. Every serious German military planner understood that fighting simultaneously in the West and in the East was a recipe for disaster. To open a massive new campaign against the Soviet Union while Britain remained undefeated and the United States was increasingly hostile to Germany would be to repeat the mistake that had destroyed the Kaiser's Germany. Therefore, Stalin concluded Hitler would not attack, not yet. Whatever the German military was doing along the Soviet border, building up forces, moving armor forward, conducting reconnaissance, it had to be something other than preparation for invasion. Pressure, perhaps, an attempt to extract economic concessions from Moscow, positioning for future negotiations. Or, Stalin's preferred explanation, as the spring wore on, an elaborate provocation engineered by British intelligence to push the Soviet Union into the war on London's side. This logic was internally consistent. Each element of it was individually defensible, and it was completely, catastrophically wrong. Because there was one thing Stalin's framework could not account for: the possibility that Hitler's decision-making was not primarily rational in the way that Stalin's was. The possibility that Hitler genuinely believed, on some level, that defied conventional strategic calculation, that Germany could defeat the Soviet Union in a single summer campaign, and that this belief would override the lessons of military history that every trained strategist understood. Stalin's certainty that Hitler would not attack was built on his certainty that Hitler thought like Stalin did. That was the foundation error. And once you have a foundation error, every warning sign that contradicts your framework becomes evidence of something else: enemy manipulation, agent unreliability, the nervousness of subordinates who don't understand the bigger picture. The more warnings came in, the more aggressively Stalin rejected them, because to accept them would be to accept that his entire strategic worldview was built on sand, and the cost of that admission, psychological, political, personal, was something he was not prepared to pay. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. The experience of holding two contradictory beliefs simultaneously is genuinely painful, not metaphorically, but neurologically. The human mind has powerful mechanisms for resolving that pain. One mechanism is changing the belief that is less central to your identity and your sense of control. The other mechanism, the one more powerful in people who have spent years building their authority on the premise of their own superior judgment, is finding reasons to dismiss the incoming information rather than change the existing belief. Stalin chose the second path. He made the contradictions disappear by deciding that the warnings weren't real. What you need to understand about the Soviet military in 1941 is that it was not simply unprepared in the ordinary sense. It had been systematically weakened by Stalin himself in the years leading up to the invasion. Between 1937 and 1939, Stalin had conducted a purge of the Soviet military that was almost without historical precedent in its scope and brutality. 3 of the 5 Soviet marshals were shot. 13 of 15 army commanders were shot. 50 of 57 corps commanders were shot. 150 of 186 divisional commanders were shot or imprisoned. Thousands of officers at every level were arrested, interrogated under torture, executed or sent to the Gulag. The purge was driven by Stalin's fear of a military coup, the same paranoia that governed every other aspect of his rule. And it had a catastrophic effect on the institutional knowledge, the professional culture, and the practical fighting ability of the Red Army. The officers who remained were, by and large, men who had survived by being politically reliable rather than militarily talented. The culture of the officer corps had been transformed from one in which professional judgment was valued into one in which agreeing with Stalin was the primary survival skill. This matters enormously for understanding what happened in June 1941, because the culture of political obedience that the purges had created was the same culture that made it almost impossible for accurate intelligence to reach Stalin once he had decided what he wanted to believe. Officers who sent reports contradicting Stalin's assessment weren't just risking being ignored, they were risking their careers, their freedom, and their lives. The entire system of information flow in the Soviet military had been distorted by the single overwhelming imperative: don't tell Stalin something he doesn't want to hear. So even the commanders on the ground, who could see with their own eyes what was happening along the border, who were watching German reconnaissance aircraft fly overhead every day, who were receiving reports of German engineers mapping river crossing points, who were listening to the grinding of tank treads on the other side of the frontier at night, even those men were hesitant to send reports that contradicted the official assessment coming down from Moscow. The result was a system that had essentially no feedback mechanism. Stalin had told the system what to believe, and the system had reorganized itself to confirm that belief, which meant that as the evidence of imminent invasion accumulated through May and into June of 1941, almost none of it arrived at the top in a form that could have changed anything. In the final weeks before the invasion, Soviet border units were sending increasingly urgent reports to Moscow. German aircraft were overflying Soviet territory with startling regularity, not the occasional overflight that might be written off as navigational error, but systematic reconnaissance flights that were clearly photographing Soviet defensive positions, supply depots, communication infrastructure, and airfields. Soviet commanders were requesting permission to go to full alert status, to disperse their aircraft from the large, exposed airfields where they were clustered, to begin digging defensive positions along the border, to move ammunition reserves forward in preparation for the possibility of an attack. Stalin's response was consistent and unambiguous: stand down. Under no circumstances were Soviet forces to take any action that could be interpreted as provocative by Germany. The dispersal of aircraft was denied. The request for defensive fortification was denied. Artillery units were ordered not to fire on German reconnaissance planes, even when those planes were clearly operating inside Soviet airspace. Stalin was so certain that the danger lay in accidental provocation that some nervous local commander might fire on a German aircraft and provide Hitler with a pretext that he suppressed the very defensive preparations that might have cushioned the catastrophe to come. There is a particular irony here that I want you to hold on to. Stalin, who trusted no one, spent the spring of 1941 effectively trusting Hitler, not in the sense of believing Hitler was his friend, but in the sense of building his entire defensive posture around the assumption that Hitler would behave according to the strategic logic that Stalin had attributed to him. Every decision Stalin made in those final months was predicated on the belief that Hitler was a rational actor who would not do something catastrophically irrational. Hitler turned out to be the one person Stalin should have been most skeptical of, and he turned out to be the one person Stalin most consistently misread. On the night of June 21, 1941, the last night of the world that had existed before, a German soldier named Alfred Lisko slipped across the border and surrendered to Soviet frontier guards near the town of Lisko was a communist sympathizer, a young man who had been listening to his officers talk, who knew what was coming, and who made the decision that he could not simply let it happen without warning someone. He told his Soviet captors, in considerable detail, that the German army was preparing to attack that very night. That artillery was being moved into firing positions, that the attack would begin before dawn. The report moved up the chain of command with unusual speed. Within hours, it had reached the level where it could be communicated to Moscow. Stalin's response was to order that Lisko be shot as a disinformation agent. I'll pause here and let you sit with that for a moment. A man crossed enemy lines, risked his life, risked being shot by his own side before he could even reach Soviet soldiers, to warn the Soviet Union that it was about to be attacked. The response of the leader of the Soviet Union was to order him killed for delivering that warning. The order was not carried out immediately. Lisko survived the night. He was not shot, but the fact that Stalin's first instinct, in the final hours before the invasion, was to execute the man, warning him of it. That tells you everything about the state of mind in the Kremlin on the evening of June 21st. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22nd, 1941, the German artillery opened fire. The barrage came first, rolling along a front that stretched nearly 2,000 kilometers from the Baltic coast to the Carpathian Mountains. Then the Luftwaffe came, hundreds of aircraft hitting Soviet airfields simultaneously, catching Soviet planes on the ground exactly as Stalin had forbidden commanders to prevent by dispersing them. Then the German tanks crossing the border at dozens of points. The most powerful armored force ever assembled in the history of warfare, pouring into Soviet territory in 3 massive thrusts. Operation Barbarossa had begun. The phone calls started reaching Moscow within minutes. But here is something that almost never gets mentioned in the popular accounts of that morning. Many of the phone calls never arrived at all. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, German special operations teams had been working methodically to sever Soviet communication lines along the border. Underground cables had been located and cut. Telegraph lines had been brought down. The communications infrastructure connecting the Soviet border military districts to Moscow had been systematically disabled before the first artillery shell was fired. So the Soviet commanders who were watching their world dissolve in fire at 3:15 in the morning were also, many of them, standing next to communications equipment that was simply not working. They were trying to reach Moscow and finding silence on the line. They were trying to understand what was happening to them and whether it was happening everywhere and what Moscow wanted them to do. And the line was dead. The ones who did manage to get through faced a different kind of problem. Think carefully about the situation facing a Soviet military officer in those first minutes of the attack. You have been told, repeatedly and with absolute clarity, by Stalin himself, that reports suggesting a German attack are likely enemy provocations or the product of panicking subordinates who don't understand the bigger strategic picture. Your career, and possibly your life, have been calibrated around not telling Stalin things he doesn't want to hear. Now you have somehow gotten a working phone line to Moscow at 3 in the morning, and what you are being asked to report is the exact thing that Stalin has told you isn't happening. What do you say? How certain are you that what you're seeing is real? How certain are you that Moscow won't interpret your report as exactly the kind of panicked overreaction they've been warning you against? And if you hesitate, if you soften the report, if you hedge it, if you wait for more confirmation before you commit to something that might end your career, then the information that needs to get to the top fast is moving slowly, distorted, incomplete. The system Stalin had built over a decade, the system of fear, of punishment for unwelcome truths, of absolute deference to his judgment, that system functioned with terrible efficiency in peacetime. It kept Stalin informed of what he wanted to know and insulated from what he didn't. It kept his subordinates obedient and predictable. It concentrated power at the top with remarkable effectiveness. In a military crisis that required fast, accurate information to flow upward without distortion, that same system was a mechanism for catastrophic failure. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was the chief of the General Staff of the Soviet military. On the morning of June 22nd, He would go on to become the most consequential military commander the war produced, the man who organized the defense of Moscow, planned the counteroffensive, commanded the assault that took Berlin in May of 1945. History would remember him as the general who saved his country. But on that morning, before any of that history had been written, Zhukov was a man who had to make a phone call. He had to call Stalin. He had to wake him up, and he had to tell him that everything Stalin had insisted was not going to happen was happening. Zhukov made the call at approximately 3:30 a.m. He was put through. Stalin came on the line. Zhukov reported what had come in from the border districts. German aircraft bombing Soviet cities, German ground forces crossing into Soviet territory at multiple points, artillery fire along the length of the frontier. It was a full-scale attack. What followed was a silence on the line that those who witnessed it found almost unbearable to describe. Then Stalin asked, in a voice that people who were there later struggled to characterize, because it didn't sound like Stalin's voice at all, whether German aircraft were definitely bombing Soviet cities and not making some kind of navigational error or accident. Think about that question for a moment. This was not a man seeking clarity on an ambiguous situation. This was a man being offered one final, desperate exit ramp. If the aircraft weren't really bombing Soviet cities, if there was some other explanation, any other explanation, then his framework for understanding the world could survive. Then the spring had not been a catastrophic failure of judgment. Then the warnings had still been provocations. Then he had still been right. Zhukov confirmed it. Without ambiguity. No exit ramp. No other explanation. Another silence. Stalin said he would convene the Politburo. He asked Zhukov to contact Marshal Timish, and then the line went quiet. The orders that went out from Moscow in those first hours of June 22nd are historically significant. Not because they were effective, many of them were not, but because of what they reveal about the state of command. Some orders told Soviet forces to repel the attack, but not to cross into German territory. Others authorized a general counteroffensive that bore no relationship to the actual military situation on the ground, where Soviet units were in chaos and retreat, not positioned to advance. For, or worse, the Soviet military command structure was issuing orders into a situation that it did not understand and could not accurately assess, because the information coming up from the front was fragmentary, delayed, and often simply not arriving at all. Zhukov later wrote in his memoirs that the confusion of those first hours was unlike anything he had experienced in his military career. Not the confusion of battle, which is always present and always managed by trained professionals. The confusion of a command structure that had been designed around one man's judgment, and that man's judgment had failed at the foundational level. According to the accounts of people present in the Kremlin that morning, what happened next was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. This was not the cold, methodical Stalin of the Purge trials, who had supervised the destruction of thousands of lives with bureaucratic precision. This was not the calculating Stalin of the diplomatic cables, who had played Ribbentrop and Molotov like instruments in his geopolitical orchestra. This was a man whose entire internal architecture, the framework through which he understood the world, the logic that governed every decision he had made for years, had just been demolished in the span of a telephone call. He didn't immediately issue orders. He didn't go to the military communications center. According to witnesses, he remained in a kind of suspended state for a period that no one could quite account for afterward, as if the machinery of his decision-making had ceased. For a few hours on the morning of June 22, 1941, the largest country in the world, under the most total form of centralized authority it had ever experienced, effectively had no one giving orders. The machine had frozen, because the man at the center of the machine had built the machine around the assumption that he was always right. And then he discovered, at the worst possible moment, that he had been devastatingly wrong. In the days that followed the initial shock, according to several accounts from people close to him, Stalin, not physically at first, he remained in Moscow. He met with the Politburo, Gabe orders. But something fundamental had shifted in him. The certainty that had been the defining characteristic of his leadership, the absolute conviction in his own judgment that had made him simultaneously so effective and so dangerous, had cracked. There are accounts disputed by some historians, supported by others based on testimony from people present, that in the first days after the invasion, Stalin believed he might be finished, that the catastrophe he had presided over was so profound that even the men who had served him loyally for years might decide to remove him. When members of the Politburo came to see him at his death, he reportedly watched them with what one observer described as the eyes of a man who expects to be arrested. He told them something. The exact phrasing varies in different accounts, but the meaning is consistent, that captured what he was experiencing. Something like, "Lenin built our state, and we have lost it." Whether those exact words were spoken, the sentiment was real. Stalin genuinely believed, in those first terrible days, that he might have failed so catastrophically that recovery was impossible, that the Soviet state itself might not survive, that he himself might not survive. He survived. The Soviet state survived, but the price of what had happened in the preceding months, the price of ignoring every warning, of suppressing every defensive preparation, of shooting the man who crossed the border to save you, was still being counted. In the first week of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Air Force lost approximately 4,000 aircraft, the overwhelming majority of them destroyed on the ground before they could take off. The Western Special Military District, the most heavily equipped Soviet formation on the Western Front, ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force within days. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were encircled by German armored thrusts, cut off, surrounded, unable to break out, eventually forced to surrender or die in place. The initial German advance covered distances that Wehrmacht commanders themselves found difficult to believe. Minsk fell on June 28th, barely 6 days after the invasion began. The German Army Group Center covered more than 300 kilometers in the first week. Army Group North was driving toward Leningrad. Army Group South was pushing into Ukraine toward Kiev. By December of 1941, the Germans were within sight of Moscow. 6 months after the invasion began, the ultimate death toll of the war on the Eastern Front, the conflict that Operation Barbarossa set in motion, reached somewhere between 25 and 30 million Soviet citizens, military and civilian, men and women and children. The largest loss of life suffered by any single nation in any single conflict in recorded human history. All of it set in motion, in part, by a series of decisions made by one man over the course of several months, decisions that all shared the same essential character, the refusal to believe what the evidence was making unmistakable. Before we go further, I want to stop and talk to you directly for a moment, because this is the part of the story where most accounts of June 22, 1941 move on to the military analysis, the order of battle, the logistics, the operational decisions that followed in the weeks and months of the campaign. And those things matter. But I don't think they're the most important thing this story has to teach us. The most important thing is this: Stalin was not a uniquely foolish man. He was not obviously irrational in the ordinary sense of that word. He was a man with a coherent framework for understanding reality, a framework that had served him effectively for years, and a framework that he was psychologically unable to abandon, even when the evidence against it became overwhelming. How many times in your own life have you done exactly that? I'm not talking about invasions. I'm not talking about historic skill decisions. I'm talking about the medical appointment you put off because you didn't want to hear something that might confirm your fears. The relationship you stayed in because leaving would have meant admitting that years of investment had been wrong. The career path you kept following because turning around would have meant acknowledging that the path you'd chosen wasn't working. The warning from someone who cared about you that you dismissed as misunderstanding or interference, because accepting it would have required you to change. Stalin's failure is dramatic. Its consequences were world historical. But the mechanism that produced it is ordinary. The mechanism is human. It is the mechanism of a mind that has decided, beneath conscious awareness, in the place where decisions are actually made, that the cost of being wrong is too high to consider, and so it refuses to consider it. The difference between Stalin and most of us is not the nature of the error, it is the scale of the consequences. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The people who depend on you, in whatever domain of your life, however limited they are, counting on you to manage that mechanism. They are counting on you to be willing to hear things that contradict what you want to believe. Not because it's comfortable, not because it's easy, but because the alternative is a June 22nd of your own making. After the shock of the first weeks, something happened that the standard narrative of June 1941 often undervalues, because it complicates the simpler story. Stalin adapted. Not immediately. Not easily. Not without tremendous additional suffering in the process. But the man who emerged from the catastrophe of the summer of 1941 was genuinely different from the man who had dismissed every warning in the spring. The most visible change was in his relationship to his military commanders. Stalin's understanding of military affairs was, in his own estimation, profound. He had inserted himself into every level of operational decision-making in the pre-war years, micromanaging deployments and dispositions that should have been left to professional military judgment. And the military culture he had built, in which commanders were shot for retreating without permission, in which honest assessments of enemy capability were reframed as defeatism, that culture had contributed directly to the catastrophes of the summer of 1941. Gradually, and then more decisively, Stalin began to change this. He started listening to Georgy, really listening, not just waiting for Zhukov to confirm what he already believed. He gave operational latitude to Alexander to Konstantin Rokossovsky, to other commanders who had demonstrated actual battlefield judgment rather than political reliability. He learned to distinguish between bad news that required action and bad news that required punishment. And he slowly, imperfectly, began to respond to the former by acting rather than by shooting the messenger. He never became a genuinely open leader. The paranoia never fully left him. The cruelty never entirely subsided. Right to the end of his life, Stalin remained capable of the kind of capricious brutality that had defined his rule. But the catastrophe of June 22nd taught him something, at the cost of millions of lives, that no lesser lesson could have reached him. It taught him that a system built entirely around the certainty of one man is a system that fails catastrophically when that man's certainty is wrong. He learned to doubt himself. Too late for the men and women who died because he had refused to doubt himself in the spring of 1941, but not too late, ultimately, for the Soviet Union. I want to take you to one final place, because it captures something about June 22nd, 1941, that no statistic, no strategic analysis, no account of Politburo meetings can fully convey. On the western bank of the Bug River, right on the Soviet-German border in what is now Belarus, there was a fortress, the Brest Fortress. It had been built in the 19th century, and by 1941, it was surrounded by the modern city of Breslau, which had passed between Russian, Polish, and Soviet control in the churning political geography of the early 20th century. The fortress housed a Soviet garrison of several thousand soldiers and their families. When the German artillery opened fire at 3:15 a.m. on June 22nd, the Brest Fortress was one of the first targets. The initial bombardment was devastating. Barracks were destroyed. Communication facilities were obliterated. Many of the garrison's officers were killed in the opening minutes. The German plan called for the fortress to be taken within hours. It was an obstacle that needed to be cleared quickly so the advance could continue. The garrison, caught completely by surprise, with no warning, with no preparation, with many of their officers dead and their command structure in ruins, they should have been overrun by... Instead, they fought for weeks. For weeks, with no resupply, with no reinforcement, with no communication from Moscow, because Moscow itself was in chaos, with no orders from higher command. Because there was no higher command left that could reach them, surrounded by German forces that had long since moved on to other objectives, leaving reduced forces to mop up what should have been a finished problem. The defenders of the Brest Fortress fought because they were soldiers, and this was their ground, and they had decided, in the complete absence of orders, in the complete absence of any rational expectation of rescue, that they would not surrender. Not yet. Not while they could still fight. Some of them survived long enough to scratch messages into the walls and floors of the fortress, messages that were found by Soviet investigators years later, after the war was over and the fortress had been liberated. One of them, found carved into the stone of a fortification, read, "I am dying, but I will not surrender. Farewell, motherland." No date, no name. Someone who knew they were going to die, who wanted it recorded somehow that they had been there, that they had chosen this. They had no idea whether the Soviet Union was still standing. They had no idea whether anyone was coming. They had no idea whether their resistance meant anything in the larger context of a war they could not see. They fought in a complete informational void, sustained by nothing except their own character, their own refusal to accept the obvious conclusion. The tragedy, and I want you to hold both things at once, because they're both true. The tragedy is that their sacrifice was made necessary, in no small part, by a failure that had nothing to do with them, the decision that left them unprepared on the morning of June 22nd, that denied their commanders the permission to disperse forces and dig positions and go to alert status, that ignored every warning that could have given them a fighting chance. Those decisions were made by a man in Moscow who could not bring himself to believe the truth. The courage at the Brest Fortress stands as testament to what human beings can do when everything else has failed. It also stands as a permanent indictment of what happens when the people responsible for protecting those human beings choose their own certainty over their own people's lives. History holds both things. It never lets either one go. Before I leave you with this, I want to say something directly to you, because I think about this every time I sit down to tell these stories. We tell ourselves that history is about other people, other times, other failures. We tell ourselves that the men who made the catastrophic decisions of the past were uniquely blind in ways we would never be. We distinguish ourselves from them because the alternative, acknowledging that the same mechanisms operate in us, is too uncomfortable to sit with for very long. But the mechanism is the same. The mechanism is always the same. The question that Stalin couldn't bring himself to ask. In the spring of 1941, while the warnings were piling up and the evidence was accumulating and every intelligence officer who wasn't afraid of being shot was trying to tell him the truth, that question was simply, what if I'm wrong? What if the framework I've built for understanding the world is missing something important? What if the person bringing me unwelcome information is telling me the truth? What if the painful conclusion is the correct one? Those questions feel like weakness. They feel like doubt. In a culture that celebrates certainty and decisiveness, they can feel like failure itself. But they are the most important questions that any leader, any person, any one of us can ask, because the alternative, the certainty that we understand the situation completely, that the warnings are mistaken, that the uncomfortable truth can be safely dismissed, the alternative is June 22, 1941. The alternative is being right. And being right, and being right. Right up until the morning, when everything burns. If this story stayed with you, if something in it made you look at your own certainties differently, even for a moment, then share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me which moment in this story hit you hardest. And if you want to keep going deeper into the Eastern Front, into the stories of the men and women who fought and survived and endured the most brutal conflict in human history, subscribe and stay with me. There are so many more stories to tell. None of them are comfortable. All of them matter. The person who carved those words into the stone at Brest. I am dying, but I will not surrender. They didn't know anyone would ever read them. They did it anyway, because some things need to be said, even when no one is listening. You're listening now. Remember, Tim.